Okay, now that we've looked at how social issues become identified as problems, and we've looked at some of the roles that social workers play with regard to social problems, we want to move forward and look at potential solutions or concepts around solutions that might be developed in order to address a social problem. So we know that there are different perceptions and different ways of experiencing the same situation or condition, and that results in multiple realities or subjective realities. And perceptions and experiences of problems, they might change over time, right? In different time periods and different sets of people or different groups of people may define a problem differently and may experience it differently. And the important thing about that is how a problem is defined dictates how it's going to be treated, right? So we have problems, we have social problems that have existed in one way, shape, or form for a very long time. And sometimes it seems like it's futile to try to address them. If we had the magic answer, those problems would already be resolved, right? Well, maybe part of the challenge is that as life evolves, as the world evolves, as time moves on, the way in which people live their social lives changes, those problems get defined differently, and therefore different solutions are necessary in order to address the same social issues, even if they look a little bit different. It also determines who is involved in finding the solutions and which solutions are implemented and what resources are allocated in order to attempt to resolve an issue. Some examples of this might be, things that you might be familiar with or have heard of. When you think about something like poverty, for example, right? Poverty has been around since it seems like time began, right? All of human history, we have known about the experience of poverty. So in more contemporary years in the United States anyway, we have even managed to claim war on poverty. And this is shown through in our policies and programs and services to address people living in poverty, right? And so one of the ways in which we have tried to address this war on poverty, is by doing things to help people get out of poverty, to help increase their wages and their assets, to improve their living conditions, to better their opportunities so that they can move up in the social stratification of our class system within society, giving them opportunities for education or healthcare or whatever that will elevate them out of poverty. So that approach is part of the concept of the war on poverty, which was sort of a term or a statement used to define those efforts or to describe those efforts that derived like back in the 50s and 60s. Later, as we have looked at some of those approaches to trying to help people in poverty, that takes money and resources, and a group of people who aren't satisfied with that decided that we actually needed more like war on welfare, that welfare was maybe the problem, and that our ways of helping people exit poverty were actually perpetuating the problem and keeping them in poverty and disincentivizing them to work their way out of poverty. So the war on welfare became this model of efforts to still try to address the issue of poverty, but more about changing the way in which the system is set up to help people in poverty. So this is when we had major reforms in the welfare system, which are, constantly happening. Every generation has some type of reform on welfare. One of the most recent ones that we still have, implications from today happened about 25 years ago during the 90s when there was major welfare reform and the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act was passed. And when you think about even the title of that particular policy, it basically says that people who are living in poverty are to blame for their own plight. And it's their responsibility to get out of that plight and to make a change for themselves, rather than relying on or being granted assistance, through government programs and services and funding to support them. So the definition or the idea of what the problem is and what the cause of the problem is changes how the solutions are created and implemented to address the problem. Another example to maybe think about is people with a mental health issue or a disability of some kind. Okay, so depending on how you look at that issue and what the cause of it is, again, kind of dictates how the problem might be addressed. So historically, mental health issues, people with severe and persistent mental illnesses, especially during times when we did not have a good understanding of brain disorders like that, or people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, and some of the different forms of that, whether it be autism or Down syndrome or some other type of pervasive developmental disability. Historically, those issues have been viewed in different ways. So there have been times in our history where we have literally thought that the reason why people have those issues was because it was a sickness, they were ill. And therefore, the way to address it was to doctor with them, to provide some kind of medical provision to try to make it go away, or to cure it, or to make it better. But without having a lot of information or the kinds of advances in medicine that we have now, the methods of doing that were not usually very helpful and not always very humane. In other times, those challenges were actually viewed as choices that people made, and their behaviors were criminalized. And in that case, then the way to treat them was punitive, and they would get locked up in prisons, in asylums. And those are basically just different types of correctional facilities. But they were definitely punitive in nature. So if something's viewed as like a sickness or a disease, the treatment might be more rehabilitative or curative, or something to alleviate symptoms. But if it's viewed as a crime or a sin or a bad choice, then it's oftentimes criminalized and treated in a punitive way. So the point is that, the way in which we think about social problems can change over time based on different, cultures, different societal trends, different societal views, evolving technology and advances in technology and medicine, and just changes in social values and belief systems and those sorts of factors. Those contribute to the way in which things are viewed, and therefore the way in which they are dealt with. So some social problems that, well, let me restate that. There's basically been 4 main ways in which social problems have been addressed throughout time, right? You either try to prevent it from ever happening at all, right? Or if it has happened, then you try to alleviate the symptoms of it, or minimize the problems that arise from it, or whatever the negative results of it are, you just try to make it a little bit better. Or there's the punitive approach, like I talked about. If the people experiencing the social problem are deemed unworthy or not deserving, then oftentimes they've been treated in a punitive way. And the 4th way that things have been treated have been using a curative approach. So trying to resolve it altogether, get rid of it, fix it, cure it, whatever can be done to make it go away and never come back, right? So when you look at all kinds of social policies, programs, and services, the vast majority of them fall under one of those 4 categories of approaches. Mostly what you'll find is that we have been much more reactive than proactive when social problems have been identified, and most of the approaches tend to end up being more like a Band-Aid approach instead of something that's maybe considered to be more transformative. And a lot of times when you're dealing with groups or organizations or agencies or even public policies being implemented, there are a lot of different interpretations of things and how to work together, I guess you could say. So oftentimes you will find that the very people or places that are trying to help the same issue, they have the same cause that they're working towards, they end up being kind of competitive. And there's lots of factors that go into that as well. And sometimes one of the factors is this fear of duplicating what any given group might be doing. My argument would be that there's usually more than enough need to go around where duplication of services is probably a non-issue by and large, but that's a conversation for another day. At any rate, what we're hoping to do and to work towards in this class, or to learn more about, is how to do things in a more collaborative way and not a competitive way. A more transformative approach to resolving social problems can make a bigger difference. When people are working together instead of working against each other for the same cause, you're going to make a bigger impact. So one example of a transformative approach, to address a social problem is when something uses, or when people use like the collective impact model. So for those of you who might be in the Omaha area, you might be familiar with MATCH, the Metropolitan Area Coalition the Homeless Coalition. I totally lost the name of it. Anyway, it is an organization that brings together all of the services and programs within our area that serve the homeless population at different levels. And they work together to address all of the different facets of homelessness and try to make a difference at every level as best they can in order to resolve the issue as a whole. So they recognize that all of the different services and agencies have their own strengths and assets and resources to bring to the table, and that they can do more when they work together. And so they collaborate on grants. They all go in on, the same, they all put something in order to try to address the homeless population and all of its challenges within the Omaha metropolitan area. Now the actual name will come to me probably after I'm done recording, so I apologize. Anyway, the point is that in order to make social change actually happen and be successful is to not rely on traditional approaches where, especially ones that are more like a Band-Aid approach and just alleviate or kind of minimize symptoms or just fix part of the problem or whatever. You really need to be transformative and to do something that probably hasn't been done before, or at least not done in the same way. You need to think outside the box. We need paradigm shifts. We need to, really come up with innovative designs to solve problems through social action for social change. And we need to, look at some positive examples in history. Things like, I talked about people with mental illness or disabilities. Historically, those populations have been institutionalized, right, in training centers or state hospitals or asylums or, different things like that. And so we have had movements, for the past 50 years to really try to deinstitutionalize people and integrate them into the community, integrate them into our education system and into our employment system. And we've passed laws that have said that it's not okay to discriminate against people with disabilities or mental health issues. And a lot of energy and time and resources have gone into getting people out of institutions and into the community and preventing them from being placed in an institutional setting by ensuring that they get the proper or appropriate supports to allow them to stay in the community. I talked about homelessness. So a paradigm shift with regard to ways in which we've addressed homelessness is the housing first model, right? So throughout history, a lot of our approaches had to do with, okay, we can help you if you go to rehab for a drug issue, if you get a job, if you get some vocational training or get your GED or whatever. If you do these things first, then we can provide you with housing options or financial support to get into housing. Well, in the past couple of decades, we've realized that that is not what people need. People need to have their basic needs of shelter met first before they can work on any of those other issues that might be contributing to their homelessness. So before anyone can really stabilize and be successful in having stable housing, or be successful, have stable housing, and then you will see these other parts of their lives hopefully fall into place which will allow for them to have sustainable housing long term. Another example of a paradigm shift in the way things are done is within the long-term care industry for older adults. When you think of long-term care, you're usually thinking of like a nursing home. Unfortunately, nursing homes have kind of gotten a bad rap in American society and kind of have a negative connotation to them. Sometimes that's kind of deserved, and other times not so much. There's sort of a stereotype, and there is definitely room for improvement in that industry, but there's also a place for long-term care settings within the continuum of care. That is the term I'm backtracking just momentarily. MATCH is the metropolitan area continuum of care for the homeless. Back to long-term care, though, for older adults. An example of a culture change model in long-term care is the Eden Alternative. And without going into a long explanation of it, basically it's a model of care that is, first of all, more of a social model of care rather than a medical model of care. And second of all, it's a model of care that starts from the bottom and works its way up, rather than a trickle-down effect from administration at the top and working its way down. So it involves, person-centered care. So the person that's receiving the care is at the center of everything that's done, and everything, all of their needs are met based on their preferences and their interests and their directions, rather than kind of having other people's ideas imposed on what they need and what should be done to meet their needs. So it's just one example of a paradigm. Those are just some examples of paradigm shifts in different industries that have been somewhat successful over time. There's still challenges, of course, in all of those, and change does not happen quickly, by the way, just so y'all know. These are usually innovative social change efforts that are transformative and that do involve paradigm shifts, take generations to actually see a huge difference. So patience and persistence pays off, hopefully, in the end, but it usually does take some time. So I guess I just want to say that, despite the opportunities and challenges, social innovation is our imperative. It's our call to action as social workers in order to address social problems. One of the readings for this week described the nonprofit innovation model that basically describes a process where the nonprofit sector can be innovative and create calls to action and social action efforts by initiating and creating momentum to address a social problem, by investigating thoroughly in order to understand the social condition and social problem, being innovative in order to generate solutions, and integrating in order to implement and embed those innovations, because what we know is that innovation must be a part of the culture of how groups and organizations operate, and they can't be reliant on just dedicated resources or monies aimed at fixing something. It has to be like in the DNA of the social action organization or group that is trying to combat change. So just in closing, in order to create change, it's critical that a demand is made to the people in power And this is what an issue allows for. So making an issue into a social problem. So being specific, part of the action plan needs to be specific. So having concrete, measurable requests or demands that will help to resolve or provide for a solution for an issue, that's what the hope is. That positive change in people's lives and can be made, and those efforts can be winnable and in a reasonable amount of time, and you have a clear target, and oftentimes we're going to aim for the lowest hanging fruit first. So going after the people who have power and can meet the demands, even if they're incremental and progressive. We start with the lowest hanging fruit and then work our way up. But ultimately, social action will result in social change. It's a collective endeavor to promote a cause or make a progressive change in the face of opposition. Often it involves bringing together and mobilizing aggrieved persons to begin to take direct action. Efforts at systemic intervention designed to prevent problems, expand opportunities, and enhance quality of life. That's what social action is all about.